The Word became flesh and lived among us. This is the mystery of Christmas, the disruption of incarnation. God breaking in to the broken world. Not a far-off divinity looking down on the world, but God fully infleshed, fully human and fully divine, mysteriously and inexplicably fully present in and to humanity. The Word became flesh and lived among us. This is the grace of a God with skin. The Word and words. You might notice in the printed text in the bulletin that we just read that the word that we hear about in the beginning of the Gospel of John is capitalized. There's no mention of words, only the Word with a capital W. This detail became important to me near the end of my seminary days when I closely read the ordination vows at the service of ordination. One part is called the Solemn Declaration, where a candidate for ordination not only has to say it aloud during the service, but also sign a printed copy. It reads, in part, "I solemnly declare that I do believe the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testaments to be the Word of God and to contain all things necessary to salvation." Words and the Word of God. What you can't hear is that word and Word of God in that case is not capitalized. It's a small w word. You can check, I can show you the book where it's written. Small w word, Word of God, which is different than what we have in our gospel reading today. Now, this little detail mattered to me so much that I actually wrote a 10-page paper about it. The difference between small w Word of God and big W Word of God. I solemnly declare that I do believe the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testaments to be the Word of God. Small w. The Word of God referenced here is the Bible. It's the words on the page or the parchment of what people of faith through the ages have collectively decided is holy. It's the story of God's people through the ages, written, passed down, edited, collected over roughly 800 years, give or take a century or so. The Holy Scriptures include poems and stories, historical tales of nationhood, palace intrigue, devastation of destruction and exile, expressions of hope and new life. There are letters to communities of faith as they figure out how to be faithful in new circumstances. And it's all theology, God talk, trying to make sense of our lives and the world. We call it the Word of God with a small w. Whatever that distinction means, it is somehow penultimate. Small w word is of somehow a lesser order than the capital W Word. The Word of God that we hear and celebrate tonight is different. It's written with a capital W, not words on a page or a parchment, but a living, breathing human baby. The Word became flesh and lives among us. God incarnate, Emmanuel, God with us, capitalized. The difference between words and the Word is a difference between the words on a page or a parchment and a word that is a person, a fully enfleshed human being with all the beauty and messiness that implies. A few parishioners and I prepared for this coming of this word, this Advent, by learning about some of the words of the most impactful theologians of the early 20th century. It's the all-German lineup was this course titled Breaking Into the Broken World. And it was so because they had all experienced the spiritual, physical, and psychological impact of 2 world wars in Europe. They were people who were there in the trenches of Europe, literally and metaphorically. Some were forced to live in exile. One was killed in a concentration camp. Learning about their lives put their theology in different perspective. Their words came to mean something more, knowing that it was the big W, Word of God, that guided them as fully enfleshed human beings. Dietrich Bonhoeffer went so far as to name the difference as part of his theology of grace. He differentiated between what he called cheap grace and costly grace. Cheap grace, he wrote, means grace as a doctrine, a principle, a system. It's grace as intellectual assent to an idea, general, abstract, unconnected to real life. As such, cheap grace, he wrote, amounts to a denial of the living Word of God with a capital W, the incarnation of the Word of God, baby Jesus, whose birth we celebrate tonight. Costly grace, on the other hand, means following in the way of the person, Jesus Christ, from his babyhood through his life of teaching and healing, suffering, death, and resurrection. Much more than an idea or a concept or a doctrine, costly grace is what we experience when the person of Jesus meets our person, fully enfleshed human beings both, in our messy, beautiful, terrible, scary, unpredictable, complicated, joyous world. Words matter. A meaningful poem, clearly written instructions, a clinically factual outline of an event, a poignant description of how we feel and experience life. Words matter. Words create and describe our world. We can't live without them. Fully enfleshed human beings, though, are more. Words are part of us. They're not the fullness of us. And even if we get our words perfect, no person will ever be perfect. When a person I had met at a coffee shop recently told me about the difficult and kind of complicated circumstances of his life currently, I responded, "You gotta get it together, man." And he replied, "This is me together." And we both laughed. Messy, imperfect, difficult, and complicated is the human condition. This is never going to change. And this is where the person of Jesus Christ, born tonight, meets us in the fullness of our personhood, in our grief and our trouble, in the beauty and joy, the uncertainty and struggle of our lives. The Word became flesh and lived among us. The skin with which God becomes enfleshed this night is not the skin of a mighty warrior or a wealthy business owner or a powerful political leader or a beautiful social media influencer. The skin with which God becomes enfleshed this night is the skin of a poor, brown, infant migrant in occupied land. The skin with which God becomes enfleshed tonight embodies vulnerability. That is the power and glory of God that we celebrate. That is the person we follow. Tonight, the Word becomes flesh and lives among us, that we may know the fullness of God in the person of Jesus, meeting us in the fullness of our personhood. It is good news indeed. And so the angels sang.